Okay, so we keep talking about this big brain we have and how it makes us special and all these incredible things we can do, which is true. So I think probably we should end this course by talking a little bit about the brain and the nervous system. The most obvious distinction to start with is that you can take the mammalian nervous system and divide it into a central nervous system, which is a dorsal hollow tube of nervous tissue that represents the brain and the spinal cord, which are protected by bone, either the vertebrae or the cranium. And then the second part is a peripheral nervous system, which are a system of lateral nerves that are coming off of the spine, including some cranial nerves that are coming from the brain, you'll see them in a minute, as well as spinal nerves that are coming from the spinal cord. Now, all these nerves are obviously for collecting information and for sending signals out to the rest of the body. So how can these be divided up into the way they work? The first is a division between things that we think of consciously, decisions we make, like I'm waving my hands like that, that's a conscious decision. I'm also paying attention to whether these cameras are on, so that's conscious information. So I'm getting conscious sensory information that's coming in to the central nervous system, being processed and going out to voluntary commands, to my skeletal muscles, for example, and making me wave my hands around. At the same time, there's a bunch of nerves coming in that are bringing in unconscious information. These are like blood pressure or your deep body core temperature, things like that, which are used for regulating basic physiological processes. So those are coming in, and then they're being modified by these autonomic responses. We don't consciously control them. So these include things like, changing your heart rate. As you run, your heart rate goes up, or if you see something exciting, your heart starts to race, or sweating or salivation, these things that we just don't consciously control. So you can divide up the types of nerves, both coming in and going out, into those that are either conscious and voluntary or unconscious and autonomic. The brain is supposedly this thing that makes us super special. So what I want to do now is I want to spend a little bit of time on the brain. It's incredibly complex, and there are many courses at McGill University about various aspects of the brain. I can't possibly cover all of those, so I just want to give you a few tidbits of some interesting things that we're learning about the way the brain works. So here's one representation of the organization of the brain, where it's dividing the brain into different regions. In this case, the cerebrum, where we're doing a lot of our conscious thought and memory. The diencephalon, where you're sort of controlling homeostasis. The brainstem, where you're sort of relaying information, and there's also autonomic control of the heart, lungs, and digestive system. And then the cerebellum, where it's the coordination of complex motor patterns. You can divide up the different components, for instance, the cerebrum, into different lobes. And those different lobes have different roles in controlling our behavior and in processing information. These include the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And then you have, connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, a corpus callosum, which is important for communication between the two sides of the brain, because different types of information are processed in only the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the brain. And particular sensory organs that are paired are processed by only one side or the other of the brain. I did want to say that this website here is from McGill. We have a huge center for neurobiology and the brain at McGill. It's one of the best places in the world. And they have this really good website which tells you everything about the brain, which you can go check out. Now, the cerebrum is supposedly this thing that makes us so smart, right? So it's really enlarged in primates. It's the center of intellect and learning, memory, language, consciousness, and it's divided into these two hemispheres we just mentioned. Now, the top layer of that, called the cerebral cortex, is really rich in cell bodies. It has these grooves and reticulations and ridges, increased surface area, and this is thought to be why we have such higher brain functioning, if you will. Now, if you look at the top-down section of the cerebrum, you see that different parts of the hemisphere, of each hemisphere, have different roles. So, for example, language and math computation takes place in the left hemisphere, whereas spatial visualization analysis takes place in the right hemisphere, which means that you need this connection between the two hemispheres of the brain if you have proper links between, for instance, hearing in your left ear and language in your left hemisphere. Okay, as I said, there's just so much to know about the brain, and we don't possibly have time to cover even a tiniest little fraction of it. So what I decided to do was to pick out just something cool about several different brain regions. And this is just a slightly random sample of the interesting things that we're learning about the way the brain works. Okay, so let's start with the cortex. Now, one of the fun things here is that people take both the somatosensory and the motor parts of the cerebral cortex, and they try to map the number of neurons and that are responsible for processing information coming from different parts of the body. Here, for instance, there's a whole bunch of nerves in this part of the brain that are responsible for your lips and your teeth and your gums. And then in the motor cortex beside that, you have, in a similar region of the brain, you have a lot of things that generate control, motor control of the lips and the face and the jaws, etc. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some more parts of the cerebrum here, and let's just give something cool about the frontal lobe. Well, what everybody talks about the frontal lobe is the same thing, but it's pretty cool.
Relationship between the brain and the profane, we must look at the curious case of a 19th century railroad worker named Phineas Gage, and that is with a G, Gage.
Phineas Gage was on the job to lay railroad near Cavendish, Vermont.
Boy, oh boy, lucky me. Another day, another hole in the ground.
Legend has it, he forgot to pack the hole. It ignited and blew a 3-foot 6-inch iron rod completely through the skull, landing the hole 82 feet behind him. Peak immediately after the accident.
I say, shit!
So this guy here, his name was Phineas Gage, and he was working on the railroad. In those days, you would have to you'd use that metal rod there to tamp dynamite charges down into the holes that were going to be used for blasting. And it went off as he was tapping it and shot that rod straight through his skull. Now, it went through his temporal lobe, and what happened, primarily, was survived, but what happened was his personality completely changed. Basically, he became a jerk. He was a super nice guy before, and after that, he was a jerk. So this was one of the first insights into the role of the frontal lobe in personality. Okay, another part of the brain now, let's talk about the temporal lobe, which is important for recognition of objects and the memory and recognition of objects. So for example, if you take a rhesus macaque and you record signals in the temporal lobe, and then you show the monkey different objects and then record firing of neurons there, you see that it's basically firing the most when it sees faces. So it's recognizing faces in this part of the brain. Now, it's been suggested that there are specific neurons, grandmother neurons, sometimes they're called, that recognize specific things and trigger the recognition and acknowledgement of a particular image, such as a person. So for example, there does appear to be single neurons that record the memory and the recognition of particular people. So this is a Jennifer Aniston neuron in somebody, where they would show them the sequence of different objects, and every time they showed a picture of Jennifer Aniston, this neuron would fire, but when they didn't show a picture of Jennifer Aniston, it wouldn't fire. It's not clear how general this is among people or among various objects that one might recognize, and clearly there's many other neurons involved in the overall recognition of a face, but clearly this one is the one that's firing and saying that's Jennifer Aniston. Now there are a group of structures in the brain across the different brain regions that we've been talking about that are what's called the limbic system. And if you were to say the limbic system was about one thing, you would say it was about emotion. But it's also responsible for basic physiological drives like hunger, thirst, and long-term memory. So this is a key part of what makes us emotionally human. Now, this limbic system includes things like the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the nucleus accumbens. The pleasure and pain centers are located here. And here are the different structures, and let's talk first about the hippocampus. Now here's something really cool about the hippocampus. The hippocampus appears to be used for spatial recognition. And one of the ways in which they confirmed this was to do MRIs of the brains of people that had different tasks, comparing those that had to have a really good spatial memory with those that did not. And so this started by looking at London taxi drivers. Now London is a complete mess. You see the map over there on the left. And so taxi drivers, before the age of Google Maps, had to remember everything. You would just tell them where the streets aren't numbered, street 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then avenue A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's all named, and they're all named different names, and they're all complex spider web. So taxi drivers have to remember this and navigate effectively through that system. And they found that there was differences in MRI recordings between London taxi drivers and other people in parts of the hippocampus. But then they were criticized for this because they said, well, maybe it just has something to do with driving downtown in London. And so the researchers were super clever. They said, well, okay, fine. Let's take two groups that both drive around in downtown London, taxi drivers and bus drivers. Bus drivers have fixed routes, so they don't need this really long-term complex spatial memory, whereas taxi drivers do. And indeed, they showed that compared with bus drivers, taxi drivers had greater gray matter volume in the mid-posterior hippocampi and less volume in the anterior hippocampi. Now, I'm not sure if they know why that is, but they do know that those particular brain regions seem to be really important for spatial memory and recall. And we're going to close with one more part of the limbic system, that is the amygdala. Now, again, this is, the general limbic system is responsible for emotions, hunger, thirst, long-term memory, etc. And in the amygdala, the interpretation of acoustic features, their interpretation, not hearing them, but interpreting them, and whether or not you like them. So here are just some spectral frequencies spectral frequency versus temporal modulation of the sounds. This is characterization of sound. Now think of the horrible sounds you have, like a fork scraping on a bottle. Or chalk on a blackboard.
Shit. It's not making that horrible sound. Oh! Oh!
That has a particular set of acoustic properties, and it looks like the brain in the amygdala specifically is responding to those. And that's where we hear something that we hate and we think, chalk, fingers on a chalkboard, right? That's being processed by the amygdala. That's all I have to say about the brain. McGill is a world center for understanding the brain. And so if you're interested in neurobiology, neurophysiology, neuroethology, McGill's the place to be because we have an incredible neuro group, both in the biology department and the psychology department, but also in the Montreal Neurological Institute. So check it out. It's really cool stuff. Anyway, that's it for the lectures. Ciao.